All right, so we want to talk a little bit about actual usage of microphones, or what is, what microphones are best for what uses. Um, you know, you have to, the first thing I want to talk about is that whenever you get some microphone that's not the basic construct that we're talking about or that we've talked about, is that try to see it from that perspective, that it might be doing some other things with the things that we've talked about, and try to analyze it from that perspective. Another thing that I want to talk about is that, whenever you're talking about different microphones for different purposes, I mean, you've got like, in the studio nowadays that, you're probably going to go to a condenser microphone for a lot of times. If you're going to drums or something like that, that you might use a dynamic microphone on that. Dynamic microphones are great for on stage. They're very rugged. But nowadays, that just about any type of microphone you can buy, and it's rugged enough to take out on the road. I mean, the construction of them has gotten that well. So basically, anytime you're talking about the uses of them, basically a lot of times whenever you're dealing with percussive instruments, that a lot of times you're going to kind of lean towards maybe a dynamic microphone because of the impact of the actual sound wave, the hardness of the impact. And most of the other times that you're really going to be leaning towards, either you're going to be going to a ribbon microphone because it might have some acoustical values, or the actual values that we've talked about, at the beginning of this series are more complementary to what you're looking for, because, I mean, just an example that I'm not going to get into this with all these microphones, but you'll be sitting there listening to somebody and they'll be talking about, recording jazz vocalist with this old ribbon microphone, because that's what they used, and some of the sounds and the colorations and the tones would be good for that. Well, that can get real technical. But basically, the way I see microphones is that I've got a microphone and I want it to capture the sound that I want. I want it to have as little impact, on the actual sound and coloration as possible. And I want to do that work in the DAW so that I can shape that capture and all the aspects that we've talked about as much as I can myself. That way that I can shape it towards more complementary to whatever production I'm working on, which is a huge concept to get into your head, because then you're falling back on the microphone to use it. It's a convenience thing, like I said, like you're placing, you've got a condenser mic on your hi-hat and your overheads or something like that, and you're using some dynamic mics on the toms or the bass drum, or you've used a ribbon mic at an angle, so you don't hurt the ribbon on the bass drum because it's got this coloration in it. The biggest thing you just have to remember is to be careful whenever using any of them, and to test using them. And remember, anytime anybody starts talking about usage, how far you want it to get away, at what angle, and all those kind of things, that you can spend a lot of time studying that. And I don't dissuade you from doing that, but basically you want to fall back on the specs. What are you trying to capture? What exactly are you trying to capture? And then you start looking at the specs of those specifications that we've already addressed of any type of microphone going to function for that. Because basically, that no matter what type of mic you're talking about, you're going to be going back to those specs. Are they going to be able to encompass, the capture you're trying to do? Whether or not you're trying to capture acoustics, is the sensitivity beginning good enough? Are you trying to capture plosives? Do you need something that's a little more rugged? Because the impact's going to be hard and it, and so you don't want to be using, like a real sensitive, condenser microphone that's, been made, with a $5,000 condenser microphone to, capture these huge room acoustics, and you're just trying to capture a bass drum, bam, I mean, you got to take all that stuff into consideration and what type of microphone you be using that for. Microphones can be very expensive. And some of the points of them being very expensive can be very positive, and some of them can be very negative. I mean, there's times where I could say that I've got, a $200 condenser microphone that, I probably would go, if you handed me your, real expensive $3,000 microphone, I'd be like, that's cool, bro. But I know what all it does, and I know dang well that I can compensate for what it's doing with this microphone I have here. And when I get done with it, that capture, you will not be able to tell the difference. I mean, I guarantee you. Some people argue that point, but, it's basically you're trying to capture it as well as you can the actual sound of what you're trying to capture and how you're going to capture that. So, all the studies of it, you can spend a whole lot of time on the internet. How would you place those mics? What mic would you use for your toms? How would you place them? All these type of things all going to depend on what you're trying to capture of it. Does that make sense? And, and those things can also come into, here's an example that somebody places their tom, their mics for their toms a little bit different than somebody else because they're trying to capture a little bit different aspect of that tom. Or the guitar, they're placing their guitar microphones. They've got one microphone out at where the sound hole is and back 1.5 feet, and they've got the other one leaning more towards the neck to capture some of the fret noise and some of the other higher end stuff, from the actual upper end of the neck to try to capture that. So what's happening there? Basically what's happening is they're trying to capture different aspects of that guitar sound with different microphones. And they sit around looking at the specs of it, and they're trying to figure out what microphone is going to work there. Then they start trying to look at things simple like the frequency response. If I move it closer, how's that going to affect the frequency response if I move it farther away or farther up the neck on the guitar? Or if I'm on the tom, if I move it up a little bit closer to the edge of the tom or up a little bit from the tom and back a little bit, what does that sound like? And there's really no way to know exactly what that's going to sound like without experimenting with that. So basically, the best thing to do is get a pretty good understanding of what mics you want to use. Dig around a little bit, but you'll find that, condenser microphones are awesome. I mean, you can use them for just about any application, and, dynamic mics are really great for percussive things, things are going to, drums and toms and things like that can be really good for that kind of stuff. Ribbon microphones work on the same principle as a dynamic microphone. They work a little bit differently, and sometimes you can get a little bit more realistic sound from what they say, which isn't really true because it doesn't capture it that way anyway, but the warmth in it is a little bit different. But you got to be careful with that microphone because it can be very sensitive and very expensive to try to fix if you screw up with the thing. So be real careful when you're messing with those microphones or, renting them or anything like that. So the basic thing you want to think about is, you want yourself a decent condenser microphone. You want, if you're micing drums and stuff, you want to get some good, you want to look at anything percussive that if you can capture it with a condenser microphone and capture it well without capturing too much high end, you get all this way high brittly stuff with this condenser microphone because it's too clean of a capture that you don't want with those drums. So you're going to a dynamic microphone that it's, that its frequency range or its frequency response is not got so much high end in it. And, a lot of that stuff you can just compensate in the DAW. So you really got to look at that as, trying to get as clean a capture as you can and then work with it in a DAW. Because if you go back and watch all those videos I did on sound sculpting, and spectral content shaping, you'll get a really good understanding of that. That if you can just get a clean capture as you can without it distorting or having too many issues, that you can sculpt it just about any way you want in the DAW. And or add things to it. Does that make sense? And, and it's like, so, and then it can always be someone's opinion. Tom and Jimmy and Ralph and Bob Zoo or whatever, they got a different microphone. They put the placement a little bit differently because they hear it a little bit differently. And you'll run into that can be a whole lot of times why people will go to them. And it's not always that their stuff sounds so much better, is that they already figured it out. I'm placing my mic just like that and that type of microphone, and that's what I use. And I don't mess around with it. And then I know I got to go in the DAW. In this production, I might have to EQ that way or do something with that or do something with that. And I already know that because I'm used to those microphones and I've already chosen my path. Unless something really new comes out and I go, whoa, really, dude? And then things may change. Does that make sense? So try not to get wrapped up in that too much, because I spent a whole lot of time working on mic placement and things like that it made me crazy. Because, I was running into things that were ridiculous. And I wasn't thinking about, I started getting into all this stuff about how I'm supposed to play this mic, and I didn't go back to basics. I didn't go back to, what am I trying to capture? Does that make sense? What am I trying to capture here? I mean, and what am I trying to capture of the room, of the instrument, of this or that? What's good about it? What's bad about it? How much am I going to have to work on it in the DAW? I mean, and just the basics, and because I got to where I have 2 or 3 microphones on my guitar at different distances and angles and all over the place. And I finally was like, wait a minute, dude. I finally took my acoustic guitar. I plugged it directly into the DAW, used the microphone there, for as good as it, set it up nice and clean. And then I put a condenser microphone out in front of it. So anyways, there was a little bit towards the neck, but not quite sound as a sound hole, because that's about where it's capturing it. I tested it really good, made a couple test recordings with it, and then it was fine. And then, all the work that I was going to do to it later in the DAW to sculpt that sound was way more important than that, and that's a huge thing to get through your head. Because sometimes it just is. Sometimes it's not. There's been sometimes I've seen some people and they'll just capture it with their mic and it's done, bro. I mean, it sounds good. They've captured all the nuances of the guitar and the environment and everything, and it all just came out perfect, and they didn't have to do nothing. Well, I have ran into that very few times, because most time I start working it with some different production, and that acoustic guitar, the way I had it mic, sounded great for that production. And this other production, the same damn guitar, mic the same way, didn't sound, it sounded horrible, because, the frequency content wasn't complementary to the frequency content that was in the mix. And so I had to get out my EQ and start doing spectral content shaping on the thing, and even differently in different sections, depending on what instruments it was working with, to be complementary to the frequency content in those sections. So, I mean, does that make sense? And if I didn't do that, it didn't sound right. I mean, it just didn't sound good, does that make sense? Like it did on that one, that I mic'd it perfectly and it came out perfect. Because it just did. It came out great for that capture and for that production, that it worked really well. Well, in the other production, it just didn't. So those are the biggest things to keep in mind. I'm not going to get any more deeper into that, because basically, if you like the way Tom records, that kind of stuff, then go see Tom. If you like Bob's reason, the biggest thing, when you start comparing Bill and Bob's mics and the way they place mics and how they distance them and all this other stuff, the biggest thing to keep in mind is the sound that you really want. I mean, isolate the sound, listen to their different drums or their different guitars or whatever, and keep in mind that might have been different for different production. And would that have been mic'd the exact same way for that other acoustic guitar and that different acoustical room? He recorded this studio for that, he recorded this other studio with that, so he'd use different microphones at different placements or what? Does that make sense? So basically, he messed around with it until he got it to where it was sounding good enough, the way he had it set up, and then he went into the dang DAW and did any sculpting he needed to do to make it sound the way it should for that production. And that's a very simple but very complicated, concept to get in your head. And so that's about as far as I'm taking that, because basically no matter what you're doing, that you understand some basics of that you don't want to be too close to the microphone. You understand why. You understand how the transducer works. You went back and looked at every one of the microphones and the transducers we've talked about and applied all the things we did at the beginning of this series of what might happen there. Does that make sense? And normally microphones that, you want to start out with a decent distance. Does that make sense? You want to start out between 6 inches and a foot, and then start figuring out what's going on. Sometimes you'll move it back farther. For some things, you might move it in a little bit closer. But, you want to start there. And, as you get used to using on some certain instrument with some certain microphone, that you'll find that distance doesn't work at all, and it's 1.5 feet when that guy's blasting that saxophone, or it comes out sounding like crap. Does that make sense? For some reason, because it's affecting the frequency response of the instrument. So try to pick out decent microphones and don't spend tons of microphones, tons of money on microphones. And as far as placement of microphones and what microphone usage works best for this or that or the other thing, look back to the specifications. Look to what's happening in specifications. Look to the sensitivities and things like that. Think about what you're trying to use the microphone for and go from that first. Try your hand at it like that. Later on, if you're really having an issue, that you can go back and watch all the videos you want on mic placement. But, if you worry about just getting as clean a capture you can so that you can work with it in a DAW and understand the actual things that we've talked about with the microphones and how those transducers operate, that you'll probably do pretty good. And as you get into more complex situations, that those placements might get a little bit more complex. But that's basically all I want to talk about on that right now. So I hope you enjoyed the series so far, and I hope you take some time getting yourself a couple different microphones and then start working on the placement of that and actually comparing what's going on with that with the specs they give you so you can kind of understand what's happening. So peace, hope, love. I'll see you in the next video.